One of the reasons we love Magnus Carlsen is that he doesn't take his chess too seriously, at least not when he's playing online. He's not afraid to throw out the opening rulebook and desecrate a few traditional principles by making moves that range from moderately weak and pointless to utterly nonsensical and ridiculous. And most of the time these moves produce their desired effect. They get his opponents out of their opening book, throw them off of their game a little bit, causing them to blunder, at which point Magnus goes into computer mode and pummels them into oblivion. We've seen this play out time and time again, but now and then something goes terribly awry. Maybe there's a glitch of some kind, Magnus's computer mode fails to engage, and he goes down in a spectacular blaze of glory. And this is exactly what you're going to see happen in today's game, played on or about this most recent title Tuesday. Magnus is up against the 29-year-old Vietnamese Grandmaster Tuan Minh Le, who before this game is over will be sacrificing an entire rook for an incredible attacking sequence that I can't even imagine calculating in a blitz game. Was there some intuition involved? Maybe even a little luck? Who knows? Whatever the reason for this astonishing anomaly, Magnus really gets a good dose of his own medicine in this one, finding himself in a dead loss position after making a mere 29 moves, leading to a forced checkmate in 12 on the board by move 43. So strap yourself in, send any small children out of the room, maybe call up a friend, because you're not going to want to watch this one alone. Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces, and he opens with the always unfashionable e3. This is known as Von Krausch's opening, and it pretty much sucks. In fact, you could call it the worst opening move possible. Why? Well, it's because it's not really bad enough to have any troll value, but it's not good enough to be considered a serious opening either. It's just a bland and lifeless move that I personally detest. Now, it does control a central square while opening diagonals for both queen and bishop, but so does pushing the pawn to e4, and that move doesn't block a potential diagonal for the dark squared bishop. Now this does support the move d4, but if you want to play d4, why not just play it? It doesn't need any special preparation on move 1. So this move does objectively suck, but it is a chess move, which of course makes it potentially very dangerous in the hands of Magnus Carlsen. Tuan responds with the strong and principled d5. We have c4, threatening to trade off a less central pawn for a more central pawn, which is generally a good thing to try to do. Tuan responds c6, ready to replace that pawn with another pawn. We have knight to f3, knight to f6, knight to c3. It's worth noting that Magnus is not playing the very natural d4, since if he were to play it, then the originality of his move e3 would sort of be lost, as it would transpose into some kind of lame queen's pawn opening, where white has played an early e3 for no great reason. Although at this point, I think we're probably in some variation of the English opening. Anyway, play continues a6, preparing a potential d takes c4, followed by b5, and then a quick c5, since the pawn on b5 would be adequately defended. d4 continues to be a very natural response for white, taking control of that c5 square with the pawn, but Magnus, having taken a blood oath never to play d4, instead opts for b3, which is a nice alternative, preparing to replace the pawn on c4 with another pawn if and when it is captured, thus maintaining control of b5 and d5 with the pawn. Additionally, this makes possible the development of the dark squared bishop along the long diagonal via b2. Next we have bishop to f5, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain that will be formed with the move e6 next. Magnus puts his bishop on e2, preparing to castle at a moment's notice. We have e6 and now knight to h4, giving a little tickle to the bishop, looking for that favorable knight for bishop exchange. Tuan says, that's cool, I'll put my bishop on g6. If you want to take it and activate my rook towards your king side, be my guest. Magnus says, I was only kidding, and plays bishop to b2. We have some very routine development now with knight b to d7, castles, bishop to d6, and now a rather strange looking move, g3. It looks as if Magnus is preparing to fianchetto his bishop to g2, having apparently forgotten that the bishop has already found a home on e2. So unless he's having some kind of cerebral emergency, there must be some other reason for this kingside weakening pawn thrust. What could it be? Well, in my expert opinion, supplemented by the analysis of the world's strongest chess program Stockfish 17, the main function of this move is to support a possible f4, when in some lines it can be useful to have the knight on h4 defended by a pawn so that black's not threatening to win it whenever he moves his knight from f6. So just a little strengthening of white's dark squared situation at the cost of weakening the light squares a bit. Tuan responds queen to e7, keeping his castling options open for the moment. Will he dare go queenside? Magnus ponders to himself as he plays a3, supporting a possible b4, followed by b5 to bite into that potential king shielding queenside pawn cover. Tuan apparently doesn't like the looks of that, so he goes ahead and commits to the kingside with the move O-O or 0-0, however you like to think of it. Magnus now takes the bishop on g6, the timing of which is of course no accident, seeing that h takes g6 no longer activates any black rook along the h-file. Magnus now forever tarnishes his family name by playing a move he swore never to play, d4. We have b5 from Tuan, an interesting decision, inviting Magnus to take some territory with the move he now plays, c5, with tempo on black's bishop. But after bishop to c7, you really gotta ask, is the land grab worth it when you've blocked all of your dark squared bishop's best good diagonals? The answer is, of course, don't ever question the mighty Magnus, who now defiantly puts yet another pawn on a dark square with the move f4. Just going full boa constrictor. He doesn't want any e5 getting played. Tuan says 2 can play at that game as he responds with the backward moving yet fully engine approved knight to h7, preparing both f5 as well as a well supported g5. Magnus focuses on his queenside play with b4, fixing the pawn on b5, ready to hit it with a4 next, very standard stuff. We have f5, a4, g5, and now rook to a2. This is straight out of File Opening 101, which is a great class by the way. So he's just going to double up the heavy pieces here, take the pawn on b5, the a6 pawn will be pinned to the inadequately defended rook on a8, and just like that, Bob is black's new creepy drunken uncle. Tuan doesn't seem too concerned though, he just keeps pushing on the king side with g takes f4, and after e takes f4, he forages further with g5, looking to break open the g-file when the time is right. Maybe put the king on f7, bring the rooks on over, get the knight into g4, the queen to h4. Magnus says, okay, you convinced me, I think I'll put my bishop on c1, that way I can recapture on f4 with the piece as opposed to with the pawn, and we can keep that g-file nice and closed. Next is queen to g7, getting opposite the white king. Magnus immediately vacates the file with king to h1. Tuan brings another piece to the kingside party with knight d to f6. We have bishop to d3 from Magnus, clearing the e file, which is usually a good thing to do whenever it's occupied by a horrendously weak backward pawn of your opponent's. Tuan responds a5, a big blunder. Although just a few moves back, before Magnus had played bishop to c1, this move would have been quite good. So what's the difference here? Well, after white's strongest move, which was not played by Magnus, f takes g5, knight takes g5 can be met with the capturing of the inadequately defended pawn on b5. Now black's supposed justification for this is the counter-attacking a takes b4, hitting the knight on c3, to which white should respond b6, hitting the bishop on c7. Now if white's bishop were still on b2 here, then pawn takes knight on c3 would come with an attack on that bishop, giving black a winning position. But here, after b takes c3, rook takes a8, rook takes a8, and b takes c7, black's got no easy way to round up that troublesome invader on c7, which is much more dangerous than the pawn on c3. Queen takes c7 is of course a no-go, as that would drop the knight on g5, which is part of the reason that white traded pawns on g5. Another reason is that it cleared the f4 square, so that rook to c8 can be met with bishop to f4, defending the pawn, which black could try and win with a sad move like knight to e8, but then the white queen comes into h5 and bad things begin to happen. Let's contrast this with what Magnus plays in the game, which after the blunderous a5 is the immediate a takes b5. When after a takes b4, rook takes a8 and rook takes a8, if Magnus were to play that b6 move here, then after pawn takes knight on c3, if white tries to throw in that move f takes g5 at this stage, then apparently black can play bishop to b8 with a pretty okay position. If in the engine we trust, when it tells us that f takes g5 really needed to be played 3 moves ago. The tactical details of which I'm just going to skip over and hope nobody notices, so that we can press on with the move b takes c7, which at this point is a mistake, since after g4, there is no good way for white to save his pawn on c7, unlike in the previous line where he captured on g5 nice and early, allowing him to later defend the pawn with the move bishop to f4. What's played in the game, after the rook recaptures on a8, is not the move we just looked at, b6, but rather knight to e2, which at this point is probably about as good as playing b6, just getting that knight out of danger, threatening to play b6 next, hence the move c takes b5, now played by Tuan. The obvious bishop takes b5 is a fine reply for white here, but Magnus decides to play queen to e1, going after the pawn on b4. Tuan can see that trying to defend his queenside pawns would be quite inconvenient and contrary to the spirit of his position, and so concludes that simply ignoring the queenside situation and going all out on the kingside assault is, as O. would say, the way to go. and he's not wrong, but he chooses the wrong move. Best is knight to g4, with the simple threat of queen to h6 followed by mate on h2. So white should play h3 to kick that knight out of there while he still has the chance, and after knight g to f6, the most critical variation goes as follows. Queen takes b4, g takes f4, bishop takes f4, bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, knight to g5, queen takes b5, knight f to e4, bishop takes knight, knight takes bishop, threatening both knight takes g3 and queen takes undefended pawn on d4 with a dead equal position. What Tuan plays in the game, in response to queen to e1, is not the equalizing knight to g4, but rather the borderline losing knight to e4. When after queen takes b4, knight h to f6, and queen takes b5, we now have knight to g4. But unlike the previous variation we looked at, where knight to g4 was played straight away, Magnus is now able to get a winning position with the move king to g2, which he does not play. And as much as I would love to try and demonstrate exactly why this move is winning here, it's just a bit beyond the scope of this video. There's just too many critical variations that we'd have to wade through, so we're not going to look at any of them. Instead, I'm just going to way overgeneralize and tell you that in order for black to make the most of his kingside attack, it seems that he needed to get his knights to g4 and to g5 as quickly as possible, after making the capture on f4 of course, and the quickest way to do that was to move the knight from f6 to g4 and then the knight on h7 to g5, as opposed to throwing in this move played in the game, knight to e4. After which it is still possible to take on f4 and then play knight to g5, but it will have taken a couple of extra moves, which apparently makes all the difference. And we're just going to have to leave it at that. If Magnus had actually played his winning move king to g2 here, I might feel compelled to try to dig into the dirty deets a little deeper, but after what's played in the game, in response to knight to g4, which is the utterly losing queen to c6, none of that really matters, because in this position, black has a beautiful winning sequence, which I cordially invite you to try to work out. There are actually two winning moves here. One is queen to h7, and the other is the move played by Tuan Minh Le, queen to h6, threatening checkmate on h2, though allowing Magnus to grab the rook on a8 with check, which he now does. So Tuan is really going all in here, since after king to g7, Magnus is a full rook up. But how is he going to defend against checkmate? Well, he's really got no choice but to push his pawn to h4, and after g takes h4, it's highway time for the white king. He needs to get off of that h-file pronto, for reasons that I hope are fairly obvious. Magnus puts his king on g2, clearing the way for rook to h1 in response to f takes g3. That would actually be winning for white. So the pawn is pushed to h3 with check. Now if king to f3, then black has checkmate in 4 moves, beginning with knight to h2 check, forcing the king to e3. The rook gets picked up for free, and you can probably work out the rest. If king to g1, then the pawn is pushed to h2 with check. No good reason to allow that, so Magnus has nothing better than putting his king back to h1. But now comes knight e to f2 check, forcing Magnus to part with his rook. For if king to g1, then we'd have h2 with check, followed by the promotion of the pawn, and then mate on the next move. So we have rook takes f2, and after knight takes f2 check and king to h2, it almost looks as if Magnus just might survive. But after knight to g4 check, king to h1, and h2, what is to be done about knight to f2 check, followed by the promotion of the pawn? Well, you gotta offer black a piece with bishop to e3. That f2 square must be guarded. But do you think Tuan takes the bishop? No, he's got to keep the threats coming. If he gives Magnus even one free move, then he'll play queen to e8, securing a draw due to his threat of a perpetual check. So what's played is queen to h3, threatening to come into f1, which would force mate in 3 moves. Magnus responds knight to c3, giving that square some defense by his bishop, but now comes knight takes e3, threatening mate on g2. Now I should mention that queen takes g3 was objectively a bit better, as it would have forced checkmate in 6 moves, but knight takes e3 is a forced mate in 17, so you can't really call it a mistake. Magnus puts his queen on a2, providing g2 with some necessary defense. We have queen takes g3, now threatening mate on g1, though allowing Magnus to pick up the pawn on h2. Somehow he's just barely hanging on here, but after queen to f3 check, king to g1, and knight to g4 attacking the queen, the devastating truth begins to emerge. Magnus puts his queen on e2, defending the bishop, surely dreaming of a queen trade, but after queen to g3 with check, Magnus is going to have to either block with his queen and lose his bishop, play king to h1 when after knight to f2 check, his only legal move will be to sacrifice his queen, or play the move played in the game, king to f1. When after Tuan's response, knight to h2 check, again, white can only give up his queen as his king has no moves. Hence Magnus's decision in this position to resign the game. So what a fantastic attacking sequence executed virtually flawlessly by Tuan Minh Le, who, despite missing his absolute quickest mate on move 38, never once gave Magnus a single chance to save his game once he made that fateful decision to go after the rook on a8. So I thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed the content. Leave a like, leave a comment. Those things always help the channel grow. And then stick around for a moment if you want to see the checkmate and 12 moves play out from here. And I will see you next time.